So I invited Colin Jasper, who's principal at Positive Pricing, to speak to us about the whole idea of a pricing process and what goes into determining the price of a particular matter, and then how we can take that information and add it into our collaterals to better demonstrate the value and make our fees a little bit more attractive to clients. So if you want to participate in upcoming calls like this or join our private Slack group channel, head on over to bdroundtable.com to sign up for free. Now here's Colin. So can you sort of walk us through a bit of the pricing process? How should law firms really be thinking about pricing matters?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I want to sort of preface this because often a lot of the frustration around pricing is, I think, given a specific moment in time. We have an event, we have a proposal that we have to submit. What should we price it at? How should we price it? And we think about pricing as an event. And one of the things that I would encourage all of you to think about is not so much think about pricing as an event, but think about pricing as a process. And the reason I say that is it doesn't matter how good you are at pricing, you're going to stuff up pricing. Okay, you're going to get it wrong. But the difference between the firms that are really good at pricing and the firms that aren't, are the firms that are really good at pricing get closer to the right price more often. That's all we're really trying to do, is get closer to the right price more often. And I find that sort of, it lifts the weight off your shoulders. We're not going to be perfect at this, but let's not make the same mistakes over and over again. So if we get something wrong, let's learn from it and let's get better at it. And so I really would encourage you all to think about pricing as a process rather than an event. Now, what does that mean? Well, there's a whole range of elements in that. Any process has inputs and outputs, and all we're trying to do is collect the right inputs, consider the right things to come up with the right price. So the inputs to the pricing process, there's a couple of them that we should be thinking about. And while I hear you say that BD don't necessarily do the pricing, I actually think we have a role to play in asking the right questions. So some people say, I can't do the pricing. I don't know what this is going to cost. Well, costing's part of it. But if we stop at costing, we haven't done pricing. So we have to go further. So we have to ask, well, who are we competing against? What are they likely to be charging? So another input to pricing is competition. So one input to pricing is costs. What's this matter likely to cost us? And some of the questions we can ask around costs are, where do you think the uncertainty lies? How are you going to deal with that uncertainty? Some of that uncertainty can be dealt with through scope definition. Some of it might be dealt with through assumptions, but let's not deal with all of the uncertainty through assumptions because clients hate long lists of assumptions. So some of it we must just carry the risk ourselves. But we've got to identify where are the risks, where are the uncertainties on the cost side and take into account those. On the competitor side, who are we competing against? If we're competing against more expensive firms, that should influence the way we think about pricing. If we're competing against less expensive firms, we have to do a lot more effort on helping the client understand why they shouldn't buy cheap. So that's another one of the inputs. The third input that we often talk about, and we talk about the 3 C's, costs, competitors, and client value. So that's the other one of the inputs. So what's this actually worth to the client? What would the client be willing to pay for this? What should the client be willing to pay for this? And we need to start to get into that as well. So good pricing is integrative because it's not about just cost plus a margin. It's about, given our costs, given our competitors, given what this is worth to the client, then we start to think about what should we be charging. There is one other input. So we've talked about the 3 C's. The one other input are our objectives, our goals. Because there are times we're allowed to lose money if we want to. There may be times where we say, this is brand building, or this is an opportunity to develop our skills and capabilities in an area. You can invest in doing that through pricing if you really want to. But there are other times where, look, this is a one-off. We're not going to see this client ever again. If we're going to do it, we want to make good money. And so our objectives can be different. So we take all of those inputs to try and come up with a price. Then we move to the output side of the process, and the output side of the process, there are two components of any price. One is how much are we charging, so the price level, and the other is price structure. And you've already alluded to this, Will. Are we charging on an hourly rate basis? Are we charging a fixed fee? Are we charging some sort of a success fee? There's a whole lot of information and opportunities that exist around alternative fee arrangements. Having said that, I think within the realms of legal pricing, often about 50% of the discussion is about AFAs, where I think it's about 5 to 10% of the opportunity. I think there's a lot more opportunity that exists in other spaces. So that's the process. And really the key thing I'd be encouraging BD people to do when you are in discussions with partners is make sure they're thinking about all of those elements. Have you thought about who we're competing against? Have you thought about what this is actually worth to the client? Have you thought about the fee structure that you are proposing and whether that is the most desirable to the client? Because it's our role really to give the client a fee structure that they want. If they want certainty and we don't give them certainty, they'll find another firm that will. If they want you to have skin in the game, then again, if you don't give them a contingency fee or a success fee, they'll find somebody else who will. And there are clients who are quite comfortable with hourly rates on the basis of, and I'll give you a very basic example. There's two real examples where clients like hourly rates. So I'm not one of these people who talks about death of the hourly rates because the reality doesn't play out that way. The two types of clients that like hourly rates are one where clients say, we want you to help us on this project, but we can't scope it up front. And if we can't scope it, then we know you can't price it. So let's just get into it. We trust you, but we want some sort of a fee structure which is flexible. Hourly rates provides that. The other types of clients who love hourly rates are the big clients who set up panel arrangements and want to screw you down on panel rates. And then having screwed you down on panel rates, they want to make sure they're getting charged panel rates. So, it's almost their preference that let's make sure we get a good rate and then let's make sure that we get those rates. There are many other clients, though, who don't like hourly rates for the reasons that you said up front, in which case we need to move away from it.
Right. No, that's great. So just touching on those three C's. So cost is pretty easy to wrap our head around. The competitors, how do we get around sort of pricing to the bottom? Because you mentioned that, we really shouldn't be competing on price, but we should be competing on value. And that kind of leads into the value, the client value. How do we actually determine the client's value? Because a M&A deal for one client is going to be far more valuable than another client. So how do we get past that pricing to the bottom trap?
Yeah, so the best way to do that is to truly understand the value that we bring. In other words, to truly understand why the client should choose us even if we're more expensive. And this is a really interesting area in itself because most partners speak a good game in this space, but when you really push them, their pricing behavior is, well, we have to price low. And that from a pricing behavior, they often behave like a commodity, although they would never regard themselves as a commodity. So I think the starting point is to help partners understand why they're winning work. I'll give you a very practical way of doing this. I don't want to leave it at the motherhood. So let me give you a very practical way that we work with partners on this. We often ask partners the question, think about the work that you've won over the last 3 to 6 months. Think about specific matters. So don't leave it at the motherhood. Make it specific matters that you've won over the last 3 to 6 months. Why did the client choose you? Why did the client choose you? Because if you can understand why the client chose you, that's probably why the client will choose you in the future. And sometimes it will be because, expertise and reputation in a specific area, or other times it will be a track record of looking after them. Sometimes it may be price, but you would be surprised how little that comes up. And if it's not coming up all that often, then why are we trying to compete on price? Our price has to be in the ballpark, but we don't have to be the cheapest. That's not why we're being chosen. So once we understand why we're being chosen, then we need to be aware of who we're competing against, because there's an element, I'll give you one other framework, and there's an element in pricing which is called frame of reference. And the point of frame of reference is when it comes to pricing, for all of the analytics you can do around it, it's much more about emotion. It's much more about people don't want to be ripped off. So
Right.
no client wants to be ripped off. That's what they're scared of. So I want to know that your price is in the ballpark. It doesn't necessarily have to be the cheapest. I want to know that your price is fair and reasonable. And that's really what I'm looking for signals. Is your price fair and reasonable? Now, let's take that one step further, because if we leave it as our price relative to a competitor, well, we have to be in the ballpark. But another exercise, when would a client be willing to pay 30% more than a competitor for you? 30% more. When would a client be willing to do that? And often when we ask people this question, the answer that we get is, well, if you're 30% better. But that's actually not right. It's got nothing to do with the relativity of how much better you are. The primary reason a client would be willing to pay 30% more is actually everything to do with them and nothing to do with us. It's all to do with what's at stake. It's all to do with the risk. It's all to do with the importance. And so what we have to do is understand what's at stake to the client and play that back to them. Because if you go to a client and you say, well, what you're trying to do here is fight a litigation matter where there's 500 million at stake, then the fact that we're going to charge you 5 million and someone else is only going to charge you 3, what's it matter?
Yeah.
You need to get the people who are going to help you the most. So we want to try and change the frame of reference from our price relative to a competitor to our price relative to what's at stake. And that means that we have to ask questions, and ideally in our proposals, we should play this back to clients in the proposals.
Yeah, no, that's specifically what I want to touch on now, the whole frame of reference and preparing those documents, because that's kind of what BD teams are doing and how they help the lawyers in preparing these proposals, and we have a very big influence on that, right? How we demonstrate the value. So when we're preparing these documents, I think we typically have templates that we've used and that have been recycled and over again. What are some of the ways that we can demonstrate this value, this framework in these documents? That's not just, okay, this is what we charge and these are the assumptions and this is a cap fee, and are there any unique ways that you've seen or you coach law firms in doing that?
Not so much unique, but there are two. There's a broad range of tactics, and I'll give you two specific tactics that are really, really powerful. So the first tactic that I really encourage, and it ties back to that last conversation, is to try to make sure that your proposals are structured as a business case. And what I mean by that is too many proposals that I see from law firms go through a process of, here's your needs, here's what we're going to do, here's who's going to do it, here's the deliverable, here's what it's going to cost. And that's a nice expenditure request, is what I would describe it as.
Good point, yeah.
We would like you to pay us this money to do this work. Now, if you want to convert that expenditure request into a business case, you have to be saying up front what's at stake. Now, all of a sudden, if you, in your very first section, here's what you're trying to achieve and here's what's at stake, and then at the back end you say, and by the way, here's what it's going to cost you, now your proposal is a self-standing business case. For this investment, here's what you're getting back. If you don't talk about what's at stake, then it's an expenditure request, and is this the best place to spend our money? Whereas if you're able to put into your proposal, here's what's at stake, and the amount that you are spending is appropriate and proportional given what's at stake, you totally change the dynamics of how the client assesses your proposal. Now, if your competitors aren't doing that, You're the people who have actually shown an interest and helped connect the dots and helped me understand why I shouldn't be buying cheap. And you're the only people that have done that. And that gives you a huge advantage because you're demonstrating client focus, you're helping the client understand, and you're converting your proposal from our price relative to competitors to our price relative to what's at stake. So
No,
that's one.
yeah, that's great. I like the whole, here's what's at stake, because we've all seen here, these are your needs, right? Because that's easy to prepare in advance. I have a whole file based on, different industry needs, right? And you just plop that in and then here you go. But it takes a little bit of effort to really identify what's at stake for that particular client.
And this shouldn't be a number that's plucked out of the air. This is really where we need to coach our partners to get to that, because ideally what we should be doing is playing back a number that the client has told us. So we actually need to coach our partners in how do they ask clients these questions so that the client puts the number on the table. Because if we pluck a number out of the air, we're really, if the client rejects our number, we look fools. Whereas if we're simply saying, look, it's now time for you to make a decision. And as we talked about, here's what's at stake and here's our price. We de-risk it from our perspective.
Mm. Well, I want to touch upon that in the Q&A a bit. How can we tactfully do that? So we'll leave that for the Q&A session for the BD Roundtable members. Right. There was another point you had?
Yeah, so the other one is, so that's one, moving the comparison away from our price relative to a competitor's price. This is what we're trying to do. So one way of doing that is to get our price compared to what's at stake. The other way to do it, which is actually the number one pricing tactic used in all markets other than law, is basically options. Now, I know that there are a lot of law firms who are now doing this, but instead of going to a client and say, here's what we're going to do and here's what it's going to cost, you go to a client and you say, look, there are different ways we could work with you. And we could do it in this way, which is quite comprehensive, minimizes your risk, maximizes the likelihood of you getting the outcome that you're seeking, but it is expensive. And if you can't afford that, then here's a different way we could do things where we, leave that part out, or you do that, or we do it using lesser resources. And it's still an effective way of doing the job, but it'll cost you less. There's some risk involved, or it's not quite as comprehensive, but it's effective. And if you can't afford that, then there's this different way of doing it. It's not necessarily what we would recommend, but if you can't afford anything more, provided you understand the risks associated with it. This is often referred to as good, better, best strategy, but the way I presented that was best, better, good, because you really want to present the most expensive one first, and the client looks at it and goes, wow, that's expensive. I don't know whether we can afford that. Then they look at the next one and they say, well, that's a little bit more affordable. And then they look at the bottom one and they generally come back to the middle one. It's an incredibly, and again, a lot of this, and this is where a lot of leading pricing theory is designed around behavioral science, and this all comes out of behavioral science, specifically anchoring theory, and how clients respond to a price. And I often say that if you go to a client with a single price, you are putting them under pressure because they don't know whether it's a good price or a bad price. Whereas really what we're trying to do with options is say, we're not forcing you to do anything. We're empowering you to decide which of these represents best value from us. Clients love it. Clients love options.
And you look at every sort of software as a service online, and they always have those tables. And then you look at the pro version, like, I'm not going to pay that much money, but this looks okay. And maybe next month, but I'll try the light version. But when you present the better, the best, better, and good, they can actually see what they could get. And you really present yourselves as a premium service.
And I actually think that there are many clients who are now asking for this because they're saying, just, help me understand how we could approach this. Don't make the decisions on my behalf. Tell me how we could do this together. And, this is, again, it's empowering to clients they feel empowered. They respond so much better when they're given choices rather than given an ultimatum, which I think go to them with, if you want to work with us, you've got to pay us $250,000. That's an ultimatum.
Yeah.
Whereas they love choice.
So, Colin, if we sort of adopt this best, better, good strategy, I'm sort of thinking in my head, well, do I do tables? Do I do different sections in the RFP? Because I love formatting and I like to make things quite visual. So the number one advice is, right, don't put your fees and everything at the back end of the proposal document, right? Put them sort of up in front. But how do we actually go ahead and structure that? Would a table be too forward, or what's your experience on this?
Yeah, so there's two parts. You're describing how to present it, and I'll come back to that. The first part I actually think is how to actually construct the options. Okay. And again, working with lawyers, this can be really challenging because lawyers have been taught that there's one way to do things. There are no options. This is the answer. This is how it should be done. And we, to a large degree, have to try and unteach that and encourage them to think about different ways it could be done. So a way of getting them to come up with options is, again, I'll give you a practical way of doing that, which is I'll often say, well, let's just imagine for a moment that the client's not at all price sensitive, but they're really, really risk averse. They're really, really focused on maximizing on getting the best possible outcome they can here. If that was the case, is there anything more that we would do to help them? Is there anything more that we would add in? Is there any other approach that we would take? And what they'll often do when they think about that is they'll say, well, we could do this. So I decided that it wasn't worth it because it wasn't cost effective. Well, that's fine. It may not be, and we're not recommending the client does it, but we do want to put that on the table as an option. And then you go the other way. Imagine that the number that we've put on the table is simply out of their budget. Is there something that we would be comfortable with, because we should never be putting a proposal to the client that we're uncomfortable with, but a different way that we could do this? It may require them to do more work, or it may require that we just don't attack a certain area. Is there a way we could do this for, say, 10% less? If that was the budget, what would we do? And then they will often get creative and they'll say, yeah, I could do that. And what we're trying, we need to help them understand, we don't want to give the client an ultimatum. We want to give the client choice. Now we've come out with our choices. So a more expensive one, our middle one, which was always the one we were going to propose, and then one that's slightly less expensive. Now then, as you've come to, Will, ideally, I think presenting them visually, there's a lot of clients who love it when we present these things visually, if we can. Sometimes it's a table, but it's trying to find, this is where I think there's real opportunity for creativity with the BD team to come up with a way of how do we show this to the client in a way that they get it and they understand and they can talk about. I'll give you one example, which one of my clients came up with, which was they got really frustrated that a client had come up with something which they saw as basically a very small part of the whole. And they went to the client with a proposal which when they presented it in a diagram, it was basically 4 pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. Mm-hmm. And the first piece is what you've asked us to do. But that's not going to help you with the implementation. That's purely a definitional issue. And the second part that reached out from that was then the implementation of that. And they had it some sort of because of the size of the pieces, was showing that it was actually going to be a much bigger piece. And then they said, but there's this bit off to the side as well that you haven't even talked about. And if you don't do that, that's not going to deal it. And so they had these 4 pieces of a jigsaw and they said, so here's what you've asked for. Here's what we see as the whole of the jigsaw. And they presented it in that way. So that was an example of being a little bit creative to help the client understand. I have seen other ones where they've said, well, a lot of this comes down to how hard we go at a certain area. So, for example, how hard we go at stakeholder engagement or how hard we go at discovery. So here's a minimum, here's a medium, here's a maximum. And that's the bit that's variable. And that, it may be as simple as that as well.
Right. Oh, I mean, yeah, there's a lot to go into it. One thing that always kind of puzzled me is we'll send out fee quotes and it'll say excluding VAT and disbursements. So really the client has no idea what they're paying at the end of the day when the bill comes in. Any advice on how to deal with the sticker shock?
So I'll give you the research on that area, which is the research on that area says that clients underestimate those things at the beginning. So when it comes to making a decision, if you don't put those things in, you're more likely to win the work. However, they overestimate those things at the back end, and therefore it creates enormous client angst and damages relationships.
So,
so my advice is if you are in a long-term client relationship, you want to minimize the angst. You want to be as upfront and honest as possible, and you want to sort of say, look, here, you don't want to be disadvantaged by it. So you want to be very transparent and say, here's excluding those things, but by the way, here's what it's actually all going to add up to. So you're trying to make sure your price is still being compared directly to your competitors, but you don't want to deliberately hide it, because if you deliberately hide it, it gets to the back end and the client says, this is quite different to what we talked about. And then, well, contractually, no, it is exactly what we talked about, but that doesn't help.
Collections are hard enough in a law firm.
I mean, I've actually seen firms, because most of their work is in ongoing relationships with clients who have had 3% admin fee, and it just creates angst at the back end with clients. So they've just upped their rates by an additional 3%, got rid of the admin fee. Clients who have got rid of, firms who have got rid of disbursements altogether, because if we're charging people out at $600 an hour and then we want to charge for photocopying, it feels a little bit, it creates angst amongst clients, rightfully so. So we're better off at some point in time saying, look, all of that admin stuff is 3%. Let's just put up our rates by an additional 3%. Tell clients that's why our rates are going up more this year, but we're no longer going to charge them for any of that. It's gone. It's a one-off.
Yep.
And it strengthens relationships over time by not having these add-on costs. You think about yourself, anytime you pay a bill and there's these surcharges and there's these taxes and there's, it can be just really frustrating and annoying to work with. Whereas, you told me it was going to cost 200, the invoice came through, it's 200, it's easy to pay.
Right, exactly. Well, no, I've taken a lot of notes, which we'll drill into a little bit more in detail in the Q&A. But for those who are not BD Roundtable members, where can we get in touch with you?
So easiest is just go to the website, positivepricing.com. Also through LinkedIn, you can easily find me in my LinkedIn site as well. So.
All right, I'll put all those links in the description. So thanks so much for your time, Colin. We appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Thanks, Will.